thank you everyone for joining us today. Obviously, an incredibly fraught and uncertain period. The CNN is calling it the whiplash administration right now, and certainly I think we can all relate to that as policy seems to change by the hour. And we are fortunate to have with us today some of our colleagues who've been working on the forefront of the issue and bring much experience to the file. And so we're going to hear from sort of what's happening from a business community perspective in terms of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And Dan can also share sort of how he's working with his colleagues at other provincial chambers and the Canadian Chamber as well. And then we'll hear from Dan Uso, who is a great friend of Canada, an honorary consul of Canada in Ohio, and has been counseling and working with both governments on trade issues pretty much since he was in grade 5. It seems, and is counted on as a leading expert. You'll catch him on the news quite frequently. So many of you may recognize Dan Uso from that. And then Christina Kakaflikas will speak to how the city is responding and supporting our business community. And we're pleased to always partner with Invest Mississauga and the entire team at the city on not only this issue, but so many others that we work together on for the betterment of our economy in Mississauga. So with that, I guess I'd just like to recognize my colleague Brett McDermott as well, who's lead government relations here, and we have a few of our team members on the call as well. Anne, I see, and I saw Brian Deck as well, Sandy Silva, whom you'll know, Anna Adams. So thank you all for your contributions as well. So Dan Tisch, President and CEO at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. I have the pleasure of working with Dan not only as a member of the Chamber of Commerce, but contributing to their work as a board member there, and of course my past experience working there. So Dan brings over 30 years of experience at the intersection of business and public policy. Has held senior roles in both government and the corporate sector. Notably, he served as CEO and founder of Argyle Communications. Now that's gone through a rebranding as well. Dan, I'm forgetting the new name.
Change makers. Change
makers, right? Very appropriate for the times, and really transformed that organization to Canada's largest management-owned communications consulting firm. And earlier in his career, Dan held senior roles in the Canadian government, including serving as a senior policy advisor and acting chief of staff to Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. So very appropriate that you hosted the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly, yesterday as well. So lots happening there. Obviously, extensive background and uniquely positions Dan to lead the OCC into the future of innovation and growth. So please join me in welcoming Dan Tisch. Dan, if you could share with us sort of all of the activity that you've been undertaking with your colleagues and with us across the Chamber network on what is, as we say, an issue that just continues to change and evolve.
Great. Well, no, thank you very much, Trevor, and thanks to Brett for the invitation and to everybody. We would not be able to do the work we do without partners like the Mississauga Board of Trade. And I got to say, there's never been a more important time or valuable time to be a member of the Mississauga Board of Trade than right now, right? Because we need to stand together as a business community. That's what gives us power and influence and the ability to work as closely with government as we do, because they know that literally in Ontario, we've got 150 chambers. We're in every community in the province. And that is a really, really key asset for our business community. So there's been lots been said, and maybe I'll just start with a little bit of level setting, right? Just amidst all this uncertainty, obviously uncertainty is the very essence of what is bad for business, every economy. And there's so much uncertainty right now. It's tough to sort out, one moment from the next. And, every day we wake up with some new madness here. And so the things we do know, though, right now, obviously, we're in a trade war. It is 100% caused by the U.S., not the U.S. people, not U.S. governors or Congress. It's caused exclusively by the new presidential administration. It will lower the standard of living for every American and every Canadian. And unless the U.S. pulls back, it's going to mean higher prices. It's going to mean lost jobs and investment. It's going to mean struggling businesses. And it's important to understand this on both sides of the border, right? Because obviously tariffs hurt American businesses and consumers as much as they hurt the countries and the trading partners. Second, it's not about the border, and I think the sooner we all realize that's true, the better, right? The border is just a pretext because the president cannot impose tariffs unilaterally unless he can claim there's a national emergency. And the idea that the border is a threat to the U.S. in terms of drugs or migrants moving north to south is preposterous. If anything, it's the other way around. So it's just a pretext. Third, the odds of a deal, I think, between the U.S. and Canada at some point are decent, if only because there's a convergence of economic reality. This is going to cause incredible pain for American businesses and consumers and the 2026 election cycle. Fourth, regardless of what happens, regardless of whether there's a deal, the White House has shown itself to be unreliable and untrustworthy, and frankly, quite inept in the way that it's managed this whole situation. Managed, as I use the term loosely, right? The tariffs are against the will of the American people, the advice of the U.S. Chamber, the business community, and against the trade agreement that this president personally signed. And of course, when I talk about, the lack of coordination and thought, every day there's some new change, there's some new, maybe we'll exempt, autos or agriculture or whatever. And it is literally impossible for businesses to plan, and even for governments to be thoughtful about policies that they might, or programs they might roll forward to help businesses, to help support businesses right now. There are no winners in a trade war, only losers. So if there's one thing, the other point I'll make is that the damage has already been done. Even if this is resolved, investments we hear, and we've done a survey on this, investments have been deferred, investments have been denied. 67% of Ontario businesses, according to our recent survey, said tariffs are going to hurt them. But almost half say they believe they can adapt. But how are they going to adapt? Number one answer, raise prices. Number two answer, diversify suppliers. Number three answer, lay off people. So, two of those things are really bad news. But if there's one thing we've heard from our chambers across the province and our members across the province, is that we don't want to be in this position again, right? And hence, the line I've been using is, if it's going to get rough, and Ontario and Canada have to get buff. Right. Obviously, the fastest way out of this madness requires a really firm, aggressive Canadian response, coupled with an offer for dialogue. And that's what our federal and provincial governments are doing. And it's great to see them working together. And this will be effective, right? Our oil fuels American cars, our fertilizer grows American crops, our electricity heats their homes, our critical minerals supply their military. But the other piece of it, which we've been working a lot on, is how do we trade complacency for competitiveness, right? How do we trade dependence on one market for diversification to many markets? How do we become more resilient and less resistant to change? And that's really the sort of stuff that Trevor alluded to that we're working on. So, we set up a new group called the Ontario Business and Trade Leadership Coalition that includes the leaders of every major trade-dependent industry in Ontario around the table together for the first time. And I have to say the Premier and the government have been incredibly responsive. I sent him a message saying, would you meet with us? This was during the election campaign. And he called me in 15 minutes. The meeting was the very next day. Like, that's the speed with which we're seeing things happen. And the same is true with the federal government, right? You know, the meeting that Trevor alluded to with Melanie Joly, we had another one with Anita Anand, the internal trade minister. So things are moving very, very quickly. I won't say, you know, we're still waiting for the action in some respects, but we're seeing faster response and more of an inclination towards action than I've ever seen in my career. We also led an effort to bring together Canada's provincial chambers in a body we call Chambers of the Federation, right? And so we hosted a meeting this past Monday, and we all had previously signed a set of recommendations to the provincial premiers, specifically with very specific asks. And number one on that list of asks is every province should immediately table legislation to mutually recognize standards and credentials in other provinces, right? Enabling labor mobility to happen so that professionals can move across the country, also creating opportunities for business, and also that standards are recognized so that it's easier to do business. It's easier for a manufacturer in Mississauga to develop and manufacture and ship products across the country without worrying about whether the standards are going to, apply across the country. So this is the sort of thing we're doing. We're also advocating new energy corridors across the country, or so that we can not just ship our products north to south, but also ship them east to west and overseas, right? So that's the sort of thing we're doing with our colleagues. We've expanded going back to last summer. We knew the election was coming and there was some risk. So we've really stepped up our collaboration with U.S. chambers, the 8 state chambers that border Ontario, as well as the National Chamber in Washington. And that's been really valuable because the chambers, especially the U.S. chamber, have been very strong voices against the madness of what's happening right now. And we need more of those voices because this ultimately is going to be solved by Americans talking to Americans. And finally, and I'll stop because I don't want to go on too long, we're doing our best to provide programs and tools to support businesses right here, right now, right? So helping them understand and mitigate the impact of tariffs. We have a programs team that has a number of SME programs, and we're developing a new program, an integrated B2B trade platform that's designed to strengthen Canadian trade and supply chains, both domestically and internationally. So, we're hoping to roll that out very soon. And on an ongoing basis, providing materials and information so that businesses can better navigate this period of tremendous uncertainty. So thank you for the invitation to say a few words to open up, and looking forward to the conversation that follows.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. And just so we get through our presenters first, I'll ask that we hold our questions to the question period. And that's when we really want to hear from everyone here on the call and how you're dealing with the uncertainty, and are you taking some of the steps that Dan alluded to in terms of, thinking both what can you do in the short term and what can you do in the long term, when it comes to diversifying trade, which we've really been talking about for so long. The importance of taking advantage of Canada's trade agreements, for example, CETA and other trade agreements. I think Canada has probably the most trade agreements signed with other jurisdictions. So with that, want to invite Dan number 2, Dan Uso, to share his perspective. And Dan, you bring such a wealth of knowledge and connections, and really have an inside lane on sort of what's happening, as much as anyone can have an inside lane in with the current administration. But Dan, I'd love to hear sort of what you're hearing as the latest on this front.
Sure, and thank you, Trevor, and the entire team at MBOT. Have really valued our relationship over the years, and the partnership you have with the American Chamber of Commerce and others, and Brett for your help many times over the years. Dan, I think the other Dan, it's raining Dans here, is that I thought those comments were excellent. But let me offer, if I may, I want to suggest this isn't necessarily my perspective, but the perspective here on the ground in the U.S. when we address these issues, right? And I say this recognizing the passions. I did a CBC spot yesterday where I was pretty middle of the road, I thought. And I was struck by the comments, emails, like people found my email somewhere. And I got flooded with emails from Canadians, and the first couple called me a colonizer because apparently I was too nice to President Trump. And I said, you look at my last name, we clearly didn't come over here on the Mayflower. And then the next one said, you're Attila. I said, well, at least I recognized we were Hungarian when we came over. So I can appreciate the passions people feel on this topic, particularly around things like the 51st state. But let's, if I may, and again, you mentioned I'm the honorary consul to Ohio. I'm not here to speak on behalf of the Canadian government. You can speak to your own elected officials, but or any of our clients at Thompson Hine. But just a few things that I would urge to take into consideration. Number one is, if you're looking at this from the U.S. policymaker, the president, the White House, Congress, et cetera's perspective, where this issue ranks maybe up until the last 24 hours, 36 hours, is way down the list since the inauguration. And it's even farther down the list or further. I'm from Youngstown, so my grammar ain't so good, but is where does it go in the American public's view? Like, no, most people aren't talking about this. If they talk, and most people in the American public, and maybe I'll start there, is they're not even, you're about to go into an election, or maybe we'll see how that plays out, that lasts 30, 40 days. Our elections last 30, 40 weeks, if not 30, 40 months. Americans are exhausted. We just came out of an election. It was an extraordinary election, to say the least. And we're kind of everybody, and we had an election that was already extraordinary. We had only done that about a half a dozen times, where you had a former president taking on a current president recently. And so everybody had already kind of picked their teams anyway, right? And then we had that change in July and others. So it was extraordinary, and people just tune out, right? There are people that love to talk politics in our world. And then there's, most people, when we're sitting around that kitchen island, any of us with kids, that's what you do on a Friday night. There's a kitchen island, you're at somebody's house, there's a bunch of kids running around, teenagers and whatever. And, the parents are sitting there with the open box of pizza talking. You don't talk about politics. So the only time I ever hear about Canada is because people know I do Canada, US, right? Or if I wear the lapel pin, it's just not on the radar here. And I think we have to appreciate that when you contrast that with Canada, right? That this is every night, every headline, every news, going back to the fateful trip to Mar-a-Lago in November, right? I mean, I watch as much Canadian media. I would probably watch more Canadian media than your average Canadian. And I do probably do so illegally, by the way, but we'll leave that off the for the time being. So just keep that in mind. Also, on the political radar, on the list of things, this is way down the list. I mean, to the extent anybody's following, it's like, whoa, this Doge thing got out, right? And that is a bit different. The Elon Musk, if people are talking, that's what they're talking about, because that's what's gathering the headlines. It has everything the media would want in a story, right? And it has real world implications certainly for those that are losing their jobs. But I'm shocked. I mean, just how many people in the Commerce Department, for example, that we deal with that are taking the buyouts and doing that retirement. And whenever you do these in any of your businesses, sometimes you do this, you bring somebody in and they wait 6 months and you come from the bottom up, or you do this from the top down, kind of the Jimmy Hoffa strategy, which is you fire everybody on the first day and go from there, right? And then the ones that stay feel like, I'm glad I have my job kind of thing. It's a famous Jimmy Hoffa thing, but that's what people are talking about. So then you go, okay, if I'm in the U.S. government, and this is always true in Canada, U.S., you mentioned I've been doing this 25 years. Like the Canadian, when we're Canadian government officials, we would come in and fully prepared. The Americans are like, we just got done negotiating with Iran. We just got done negotiating with North Korea. Like we came for like a friendly meeting and the Canadians are there all prepared and ready to fight. Like, that's been going on forever and a day, well before my time. But now you look at it, the U.S. has there is, in my view, never been an administration that has a need for speed more than this one. They all want to get things done in those first 100 days. But this group knows, particularly with the narrow margin that they have in Congress, that they have a very limited shelf life unless to get this right. And so on their list, it's Ukraine. It's just go down the list, what they've done on energy, et cetera. And the biggest goodie bag is the reconciliation bill. The most important thing, and frankly, the potentially most catastrophic for the Canadian government is if that reconciliation bill with tax cuts, regulatory reform, if we get that right, that ain't going to be great for Canada in its current setting, right? For you're going to have a real competitive business environment south of the border if that actually happens. Now, I've been around our political process long enough to know that that may not be the case. But I'll say, I've been saying this, and I'll quickly wrap up because I know we want to get to questions and of course our other speaker, but I just think that's something to keep in mind. Like I keep saying that the Trump administration's proposals are going to fail spectacularly or work spectacularly, and neither one of those scenarios is good for Canada, US, right? Because if it works too well, it's not going to be great for the investment environment in Canada. And maybe some of these things that now as Canada's awakened to some of these things, interprovincial trade in particular, but you just go down the list, Ukraine, Russia, China, et cetera, et cetera. That's how far down the list is. Then what the president cares about is the tax cuts. That's what he cares about, that economic agenda. And then right below that, how do you pay for it? Reciprocal tariffs. He cares about April 2nd. What folks need to understand is this is all the pregame. This isn't even the main course yet in what we're doing. And so, and I have to tell you, I'll just be candid, and I'll be more candid than I am in most situations. If this was just about Canada, nobody would care. I'll just be blunt. The only reason that the US is concerned and why markets are this concerned right now is because of the Mexico piece of the puzzle. And that's why we didn't see overnight the announcement come out on the specifics of how the auto deal is, because we're cutting another deal. The president's talking with President Sheinbaum later today. And right. So that Mexico, also because the White House got ahead in announcing that deal. That deal wasn't done yet on autos, by the way. And because it was like, is it finished vehicles? Is it parts, et cetera? And, that came together pretty quickly.
Well, and just on that, Dan, Secretary Lutkin kind of inferred that A, something was coming, and B, that they're kind of through with temporary measures. But what we're seeing now is another pause, which in itself is temporary. So,
yeah, and I'll wrap up because I think we can get into that in the Q&A, because it gets into that question of who are you talking to, right? The Canadians thought they had a deal back on the February before they were announced, as did Mexico, because they were talking to Tom Homan. And from a security perspective, we heard that for weeks. Yeah, from a security perspective, I was at the inauguration. Homeland Security said, yeah, the Canadian plan's fine. The Mexican plan's fine. It's just and we knew that the old man, the president, wanted a couple more things from Mexico. And they did that over that weekend, which was arresting the cartel member. And then that led. So there is, this isn't as chaotic as people think. There is an ask usually, and when these get delayed. Last 24 hours, maybe some question marks. But that ask, and we'll talk about this during the Q&A, had nothing to do with what government was developing. It had to do with the private sector was delivering. And so we're kind of pivoting to that. But I know that seems a bit discombobulated, but I think that's an important level setting. I will tell you, last night, for the first time ever, was the first time I started getting a lot of calls from people very close to the White House, and where we have several deals on the table with the White House on these issues. And very angry about what they were seeing by Canadian politicians on TV last night on US television, saying they are screwing this up. Because, and the line we kept hearing is, this is not a trade war, it's a drug war, and they need to understand that. And so I'm just telling you what we're hearing on the ground. But just so that when we get to what can business do, I would say tell your leaders to take a step back for a second. The Ontario election's over. It's over, right? It's over now. And so now, unfortunately, we have the Canadian politics, which is adding a huge complication to this issue. And so I'll stop there and maybe cliffhang that because I know we have another speaker in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Dan. That's great. And look forward to that discussion. And with that, I'd like to introduce Christina Kakaflikas, who also brings a real depth of experience in economic development, having previously served as Director of Economic Development in Markham. I don't know if it's a couple years now, Christina?
Yes, just 2 years.
So congratulations on that, and doing a fantastic job bringing in investment. And that's certainly the concern right now, is that we're going to see this cooling off. I suspect we will. But Christina, love to hear your perspective, and tell us about Mississauga Partners in Trade and all that you're doing there.
Thank you. Thanks, Trevor, and to the Mississauga Board of Trade for inviting me to speak today. And certainly looking forward to hearing from the businesses on the call as well. And the first two speakers, Dan and Dan, very enlightening, and I've enjoyed hearing, although some of it, I won't use the word alarming, but it is interesting. Perspective is everything, Dan, and thanks for sharing that. It's good for us to have that sort of kind of ground truthing from your perspective and the Americans' perspective. I'm representing a local municipality, and city of Mississauga is quite a large city in Canada. That's the seventh largest city. It's the second largest economy in Ontario, and quite a diverse economy, everything from manufacturing to services, and doing some leading edge things. But we are, subnational, and we really have very little control and influence over international trade policy and geopolitics. And so the impacts of a lot of these decisions and shifts are really felt at the local level in terms of job losses and companies really operating in a time of uncertainty. And if we know anything, it's that the business really favors stability, predictability. And so we're at a time now where our companies have paused on a lot of their decisions, as Dan was speaking to earlier. And so we do have a plan, and that it's a bit of a framework that I'm sure will be iterative as we learn more in talking with the business community and as this sort of situation continues to evolve. We've chosen to take not just a short-term reactive view to this, but it is a bit of a wake-up call for us. And I think a lot of Canadians would agree. Our long-held objectives, and you can see it's evidenced by the many trade agreements we've signed with other countries to diversify markets, is something that we really want to move the needle on, and do it as much as we can in alignment with other levels of government. Really taking advantage of this sort of time and what we learn to not only react to the day-to-day sort of changes, but equip ourselves, help our companies to see the long game and help them sort of bridge past this immediate situation and see past it into looking at the world as a global market. And so with that, I think what we're doing kind of can be categorized into three sort of buckets, one being advocacy and procurement. We've really made some changes to our procurement policies recently to open up opportunities for our local businesses, just make it easier to do business with the city. We have started to do some advocacy through the mayor's office, just in terms of making sure that the different levels of government who are at the table in some of these conversations are equipped with information through us, but by the business community in terms of what the priorities are for them and what, as they undertake to develop programming, what's really going to help our companies and in a meaningful way. We taking a sort of a citywide perspective to this. As you can see, it's really about not just economic development, but taking a citywide, including procurement, the mayor's office, and legal and others, to sort of identify barriers and try to remove them or reduce them at the very least to do business with the city. And so taking this opportunity to do that, as I said earlier, kind of working with organizations like MBOT and Export Development Canada and others to find resources and connect our companies to the resources that they need to both understand and navigate all the changes that are going to affect their business and their supply chains. And then we've already started to proactively talk to some of our businesses sort of on a daily basis, making those proactive calls to understand what their challenges are and communicate them up and also connect them to resources. And we've got, a resource page that's updated on a almost hourly basis with relevant information to help companies navigate. But going back to the theme of a longer term sort of approach, we are undertaking an economic development strategy this year. I hadn't planned on dealing with all of this at the same time, but taking that as an opportunity to really inform our strategy in terms of what we can do at the local level, as I said earlier, to diversify our markets have a much more proactive campaign around helping companies export to different markets, but also as we look at our investment attraction efforts, how do we diversify those? And so we're taking advantage of this time, not only to be reactive, but to look further out, to leverage the resources that we have at the local level, communicate up, advocate in alignment with other groups, including chambers. And I invite MBOT and the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and Canadian Chamber of Commerce, as you're, learning more about your businesses and what services and supports they need at the municipal level, we want to work with you to support the business community and think of us as partners as we move forward in this together. I think for us, that theme of alignment, somebody mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of it's a Team Canada approach, and that the cities are working together. I'm talking with my colleagues in different cities. We're working as a group to provide solutions and to work together on this in a very aligned way. We just had somebody from Global Affairs Canada visit with us today, and so we have those very strong relationships that we've built over time, and we're continuing to engage them and make sure that we're bringing them in when we have conversations with our businesses, so that we're taking this sort of multifaceted approach to support our companies.
Fantastic, Christina. Thank you so much. And one thing I'll also just add to that is, there have been some discussions in the chamber network around supporting local, supporting Canadian suppliers, that sort of thing. But there have also been some notions of caution as well, in that we can't forget that we do have large American headquartered firms completely incorporated as a Canadian company. I use the example of our member Walmart Canada, that employ thousands of Canadians, contribute to local economies, and in the case of Walmart, just announced a $6.5 billion expansion in Canada. So I think we need to be careful when we're saying avoid these American brands and that sort of thing, because when we're saying that, we're saying ignore the fact that our neighbors are employed at these firms and how much they're contributing to our economy. So I just kind of wanted to offer that perspective as well. But what I'd like to do now, we have some questions, but I know that everyone on the call does as well. And this was the idea for this call, is to really hear from our members and what's on your minds in terms of preparedness and as much as you can be prepared in an uncertain environment. So I'd like to open the floor up if we could, and if you could just raise your hand, ideally with the electronic button there, and we'll get some questions going to our speakers. Who would like to start? Got one? I'm sure there's something on your minds here. So just if we got a little bit of shyness happening here, I'm not sure if I'm, yeah. So look, I'll get things started here. Maybe a question to both Dans right now, and to start with you, Dan, Tish. A lot of the advocacy and a lot of the negotiations are happening with our elected officials appropriately. What is it that individual businesses can do? And I know there's the OCC has put out sort of a top 10 list of measures you can take, but what are some of the important steps that can be taken in the short term, and then maybe forward planning wise by our member companies?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's such a critical question, Trevor. And by the way, I agree 100% with your comment, and I've said as much many times about supporting Canadian jobs, not just Canadian brands, right? There are a lot of U.S. companies that are present in Ontario and international companies that are really critical to jobs and investment here. So I thought that was a really good and important point you made. Let's not forget that, right? It's about the jobs, not just about whether it's a Canadian-owned brand or not. So yeah, I mean, I think the first step is just to understand the implications of tariffs for your business and to assess the key risks, right? So, I mentioned earlier the way businesses are responding. So, what's the impact on your costs? What's your impact on your supply chain? Do you have an opportunity to review, your pricing, your contracts? Can you diversify your suppliers, which is probably a good idea anyhow, right? Like what alternative sources could there be that would be less affected by U.S. tariffs, right? Wherever they happen to be from. And so I think looking at all that is super important. Looking at optimizing inventory management, whenever we get to a point where there's some stability and, understanding how you're complying with any new regulations, looking at currency fluctuations, looking at any exclusions that might exist to tariffs, which again is tough to keep track of all this. And I guess what all this ladders up to, I think, is being really engaged with your Board of Trade or Chamber of Commerce, right? Because I think standing together, I talk about standing together, I don't mean that just in kind of, emotional or moral terms. I also mean that in terms of gathering intelligence, speaking to other businesses about how they're adapting, working with your Board of Trade to, ask questions and to seek out solutions, because that's what we're there for. We're there to support one another right now. And then the final thing I'll say is be active and vocal in your conversations with your local government, with your local representatives, federal and provincial representatives. And to the extent that you have suppliers and business relationships, in particular in the United States, get them to do the same, right? Because I think I agree with what Dan said earlier. I've worked extensively in the U.S. in my career and had a lot of U.S. clients, and we should not assume that this is anywhere near the top of the news in the U.S. And so where economic sanity and logic will prevail, as I said before, it's not Canadians talking to Canadians. It's not even Canadians talking to Americans. It's Americans talking to Americans, right? And so that's where, local congressional representatives and senators and governors, can be really important, to help us get through, this incredibly perilous time.
That's excellent. I did see, people like Ashley Watts at the Kentucky Chamber come out and, say, this isn't right, basically. I'm not sure what, this isn't where the problem is, but interested in Dan Nuzzo's perspectives on that as well. But I know Peter Nagolo at Holman had his hand up, and Peter, I'll turn the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you. So we're Holman, the automotive utility management, main headquarters in Mississauga, U.S. Can you hear me?
I think the audio is a little muffled.
This better? Sorry, I switched mics. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, I'll skip. Well, it was just a boring introduction, so we can skip that. I'll go to Daniel. If maybe you can speak to, and Dan touched upon this as well. Do you think this is the opportunity for a bit of a level set or a reset around things that you talked about, interprovincial barriers, competitiveness. Dan talked about what might happen if there is an even more attractive tax regime in the U.S. for businesses, or are we just kind of fall back on the way we've always done things? We know there's issues around productivity and investment in Canada. Where do you think policymakers are on that?
Well, I think across the board, there's a very acute awareness of the need for change. Right now, again, I've worked with government a long time. I'm, from the private sector side and now from the business association side, and obviously there's a gap. There's always a gap. Every government anywhere in the world between talk and action. But is there a realization that there needs to be change? I think that's near universal right now, right? Meetings that I've had, even with politicians who I think it's fair to say historically would, not really would listen to what business had to say, but would rarely heed what business has to say. It's interesting to hear them, articulate very different views right now, right? And so one conversation that I've had in the last few weeks with a very senior Canadian cabinet minister, involved a discussion around the acknowledgement that if there's a balance in government focus between tax policy, in other words, competitive tax and regulatory environment, versus program spending to support business, right, or industrial strategy, that there was an acknowledgement from the senior elected official, that the government in the last 10 years has focused way too much on the former and on the latter, and not enough on the former, on a competitive tax and regulatory environment. And so I think the combination of a re-elected Ontario government, a one and maybe even two new federal prime ministers this year, we'll see what happens, of course, in the election that's to follow. I think we are, and this is a bit of good news, I think, is we are, without question, I think, going to see a more economically a federal leadership that's much more focused on Canada's competitiveness position, on supporting businesses, and on addressing economic priorities. So that's not just interprovincial trade, although that one's come up a lot because that's incredibly low-hanging fruit. Right away, if implemented fully, that could compensate for the entire GDP loss due to the Trump tariffs. Right now, I say if implemented completely, and we know that's not going to happen quickly or overnight because there are literally hundreds of legislative and regulatory and professional barriers, to the free movement of goods and people across the country. So that's where the U.S. has been historically much smarter in ensuring there aren't barriers to interprovincial commerce. And frankly, the U.S. pushing us on taxes and regulation and competitiveness, that's not a bad thing, right? We're free traders, and you can't practice free trade. You can't preach free trade abroad and not practice it at home, right? And not believe in it at home, right? And so, I'm very positive though in the end, because Canada has so much that the U.S. and the world need. And if we just start paying attention to the things that the Mississauga Board of Trade and the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Chamber that we've been saying for years, I think that there's a huge opportunity to make our economy stronger, and to take all the incredible assets we have and our resources and our talent, and be a really powerful country on the world stage. We are the 9th largest economy in the world, right? And I mean, so Canadian self-image as the small, country at the mercy of a much larger neighbor. If we weren't beside the U.S., but we were beside, most of the countries in the world, we wouldn't have that self-image, right? So I love the fact that Canadians are thinking boldly and speaking boldly right now, because that's what's needed. And I think there's an opportunity for some more maturity in the way we approach these questions.
Dan, thank you. Dan, so did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Dan hit the nail on the head. It is kind of ironic, though, that maybe it was President Trump that helped make Canada great again in a bizarre way.
More than America, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, and I think the irony of this whole thing is we had 4 years where we could have tried the approach. And I think we had to deal in the last 4 years so much with the post-COVID environment, right? And we had momentum after USMCA in the North American relationship and rebalancing trade with China, which is a problem for the United States and it's a problem for Canada. It got out of control is the bottom line. And we started moving in that direction, then COVID hit. And that killed a lot of the momentum. It also took the attention of policymakers away from managing this relationship. And frankly, it's not, I'm not saying this is right. It's not fair, but Canada manages this relationship, it's a bilateral relationship that Canada manages, and we could draw it down even more. For good or ill, we allow the Canadian government, particularly at the federal level, but increasingly the provincial level, to manage it. And there are things that government's really good at, but there's things government, and I've worked in the Canadian government managing the Canada-US relationship. I can tell you, like, there's things it's really good at, there's things it's not great at, right? And so we're already going to have an issue there when you have bilateral that only one side manages and others. But and with that's a much broader conversation. You could throw like Chris Sands in that conversation, and they'll tell you all this policy and all this fun stuff.
Right.
But you know, I do think the issue though is, like, let's say if we had tried to say, Canada, the U.S., we're going to do this together and ally shoring, near shoring, and take on the world, we weren't getting anywhere, right? For all the reasons that Dan just mentioned. It's interesting that this crisis had to happen, because if President Trump had come out and said, we're going to do this with Canada, and everybody get on board, would the Canadian public have mobilized? No, half the Canadian public wouldn't have gone on board, right? I mean, they just wouldn't have, right? I mean, this country doesn't get on board when he says something. I mean, we're split down the middle in most places in this country. So it's interesting that these crises are actually compelling action. And I'm not agreeing with the policy. I want to be very clear about that. But it is, as you take a step back, do we end up in a better place after this is all over from an economic standpoint? But unfortunately, you know, we had to do this gnashing of teeth, and it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. Where we're going on this, it's just an interesting takeaway for that on this piece. I would say one of the areas that's a huge miss on what companies should be doing right now, like that's my daily life, is helping companies, particularly in Canada, or our U.S. companies going northbound. You know, we had, you know, I hate the phrase free trade, but we had NAFTA, then USMCA trade. So tariff-free trade, duty-free trade. So most companies haven't allocated that risk in their purchase orders, et cetera. If you're usually doing just that kind of intermestic trade between Canada, US, it is kind of interesting to me how many companies don't really have that taken care of in their purchase order, don't use Incoterms. You know, whenever we do like doing business in Canada, we always tell our US companies, like, you're doing business Canada, not Kansas. It's not the 51st state, which is a joke we no longer use, by the way. Given the current, I've been saying that for 25 years. We don't say that one anymore. But it was because, like most U.S. companies, like, hey, I got an order in Canada, I'm just going to ship it. We're like, no, you got an international relationship now. And I think that that's been true over the years, counseling Canadian companies. But that's the largest issue right now that I see, is just we have so many companies call and say, who pays these tariffs? And you look at the contract docs and you're like, ooh, you know, you guys didn't answer this question. And so we're going back and reinventing that wheel. And I just ended saying, I think one of the missing pieces that we haven't discussed in Canada, US for a long time is how much investment there is by Canada, not just companies and how many jobs we've created. You know, Canadian companies in the US, I can tell you how many in this state and then states next door and all that stuff, but how much Canadian investment from the pension funds comes in, how much Canadian investment from Bay Street, like how much crude and food we rely on in the US. I will tell you, Wednesday before the tariffs were announced in February, we were talking with the White House and they had no basic understanding of the Canada-US energy relationship. And these were people that negotiated USMCA, right? So that just shows you the education level that needs to be done. And I will tell you, our private sector strategy, I know the government officials in, you know, and Dan had, you know, a certain government official over who's making a lot of noise on TV these days, and she's out there. And, you know, we don't want 30 days. Well, yes, we do want 30 days, because we have a lot of education to do with this new administration, particularly with the U.S. person that's on TV every 2 minutes these days, including this morning, who doesn't understand the relationship, doesn't understand how you make a car. And so we need that 30 days to bring some folks up to speed. So I realize that causes a lot of volatility in the system, but any extra time we can get without tariffs is good. And we should use it to the best of our ability. I did want to note, there was a comment here from EDC. Export Development Canada is the secret weapon of the Canada-US relationship. If you could talk to EDC, please use them. They're the best thing we have going in Canada-US, in my opinion, beyond MBOT and OCC. So, just they're great, tremendous resource out there.
Great. Thank you, Dan. We have another question in the chat from Tanya. And she says, could anyone clarify the implications of tariffs on the secondhand goods industry, particularly for businesses with a duty deferral program like ours? Additionally, how does this impact the process when we export these goods further? I guess that would be a Dan Uso question.
Yeah, that can be very fact specific. I think on the whole, the default should be if there's across the board tariffs, you're going to get caught up unless you fall under any of the Chapter 98 exclusions. They've removed a lot of things we do in FTZs and drawbacks. The Trump administration figured out our tricks from the last time, because people, unfortunately, lawyers started telling people how we did it. But the secondhand goods are tricky. I'm happy to talk offline on that one,
Sure.
but the bottom line is, are you falling into any of the Chapter 98s is really, and that's true for everybody on the call. And again, these are things we don't use regularly because, like the auto industry, we don't use Chapter 98 for fabricated goods. Like if it's fabricated or we have a metal product from the US and it goes and gets fabricated, we don't use it because we've had duty-free trade. Now it's like, ooh, let's go back and dust that off. And so that's what a lot of the work we've been doing is let's look at some of where some of these tricks are generally that apply in the US Customs Code, HTS US, and then go back and do it. So that is a recommendation for those. If you haven't looked at Chapter 98, it's worth a look at for some of you.
All right, thank you. I wanted to go back to Peter at Holman. Peter, I'm just curious, what are you hearing in your circles, either within Holman and your partners or customers, et cetera? What are you hearing in these early weeks?
Yeah, so just everyone, we have 60 automotive dealerships in the U.S., and we have the second largest fleet management company in North America, and we're privately held. I'm in New Jersey, but I'm Canadian. So there you go. It's top of mind in this industry for obvious reasons, right? We're automotive. We put components on trucks. I'll echo what Dan said in the sort of localized zeitgeist. No, but in our industry, certainly our partners at the U.S. Chamber, and we're a corporate member. Our partners are at NADA, which are the new car dealers, and they're a pretty influential group in DC. It is at top of mind because it's going to add cost onto our fleet customers and our consumers. So I don't think anyone believed it until maybe this week, but certainly it's top of mind, and especially all of those components and people are adding those extra things on vehicles. They're concerned.
Great, thank you. I wanted to also ask any of the speakers if you can comment on the effectiveness of what we're doing in terms of the subnational advocacy, whether it be at the state level. We're looking at reaching out to some local chambers where our own members have distribution partners, et cetera, warehousing that certainly employ Americans. How effective can that be, Dan Uzo, when you talk about the education that needs to happen, not only at the White House, but just writ large, especially in red states, if we're being sort of strategic?
Well, there's been a fantastic job. I mean, MBOT and OCC and the Canadian and the Alphabet Soup in Ottawa, and those are all friends and family that love those folks. And like Team Canada did a nice job too. It's important, I think, so you mentioned, so we had a letter that went out from 6 of our Ohio Association heads, so our business roundtable, right in January, right after the inauguration, supporting the Canada-US and North American trading relationship. And those folks are on the phone regularly. I think there's a lot of positive momentum. Keeping engaged with those folks is successful. I think it's important. It's a have to, right? We have to do that. We have to make sure, and that's also going to be hopefully to mobilize those folks if things get off the rails here in April, May, June. It is not moving the needle at all right now, right? Because again, the public attention's not there, the policy making attention, but you have to do that work, but that's not the end in and of itself, right? The way the president makes decisions, by all accounts, and in my experience, has been he makes every decision. Whether you believe that or not, that is actually true. That he cares about, like the big ones. The other stuff he could care less about. But something like this, it's going to be his call, right? That's why people don't know. Like Lutnick tells us this, Navarro tells us this. You don't know. But what the president will do is he has about 10 people that he calls before he makes every decision. And that group changes on the subject matter and the geography. So if it impacts a certain member of Congress, you got to know who his friends are and who he's going to be calling on in New York or Ohio or anything like that. So you got to know, and we've been successful on this just in the last few weeks since the inauguration, most of the time. We missed once. And I'll tell you, when you miss, here's the mistake you make is anybody that tries to do traditional advocacy, it doesn't work. That's not how he does business. He does business like a business leader. He's talking to like his buddies and these just happen to be, instead of his business leaders, fellow business leaders, or people he hung out with in New York or Mar-a-Lago, it's the people that are now members of Congress and senators and governors. And because he's built these political networks now, he understands politics. Now, I'm mindful of the time, but I think it's an important takeaway. You got to know who the 10 people are. That's where you have to know the people that know who he's talking to. Like, hey, and there are some issues, like, candidly, I don't know. I know trade, I know transportation, I know certain things. I don't know certain issues, so I'll rely on other people. But if you don't get all 10, you got a problem. Because if you don't, in the times that I've missed with President Trump have been when we maybe have 8 of the 10, but those last 2 are always the last 2 he talks to. And the last person he talks to usually has a lot of influence. And so it's really important. So that's why a lot of people walk away thinking, hey, we got to deal with Homan or Lutnick. It's like, hey, you got to deal with them, but they don't speak for the boss. Nobody speaks for the boss. And so you better be talking to those 10 people too, that says this is what he's thinking. And that's why it seems like chaos. But if you kind of understand that, it's not as chaotic. You're like, what I look at it usually at, I'm like, whoever was running that project missed. They didn't get so-and-so, and if you know who he's talking to on certain issues, that's how. And Canada's got a great ambassador and a great team at the embassy. They do a fantastic job, and they kind of know that landscape. It was funny when a group of, we'll say, Canadian elected officials went down and spent a lot of money, and they got certain meetings, and those were good meetings. But at the same time, the embassy was talking to somebody else, and it was like, which one of those 2 meetings would I want if I would have wanted the embassy meetings, to be honest with you, at that point. So, and that's just, you have to understand that piece of this. But I do want to emphasize, like, this is all of this stuff with Canada and Mexico on fentanyl and border. I disagree with the earlier comments that it's pretext. It's not. It is that we just consistently hear that. But now it's transitioning to the trade discussion. There's no question, and I think this may have been the key point from that earlier comment, is it's to put leverage now we're moving into the trade discussion, which will be USMCA. We know that's going to be dairy, lumber, all the usual suspects. But if we can keep it in that lane, we'll be in a good place. The president's not going to make money off the Canada-US tariffs that he's announced. Those are short term.
Right.
He's going to make money off the reciprocal tariffs. That's why that's all he talks about now, because he sees that as a price tag. He sees dollar signs on the reciprocal tariffs, and he's got to pay for his tax cut. And that's why we have the Internal Revenue Service. So sorry, I rambled on there, but I just think it's important to keep that perspective of how decisions are made.
Okay.
So when you're watching this, it's like, who's saying that and who did they talk to? That's the filter you have to look through. And then it kind of starts to, I cautiously say it starts to make sense. And I realize how crazy that sounds, trust me.
Well, and what you said is especially true when you carve out automotive and have a lower tariff on energy. I mean, those are the 2 big ones in terms of the trading relationship. So appreciate those comments. I know we're running over. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Any final comments from any of our speakers? Happy to entertain final word or.
Well, I'll just jump in and just say thank you. It was great, being on the panel with such smart and thoughtful colleagues, and to you, Trevor, and the Mississauga team, and to all the members who participated. I do think fundamentally that we can be very optimistic in the end about what's going to happen once we're through this tunnel. I think that I try to avoid using the words unprecedented and to say permanently, because, we've been through some very hard times before, just perhaps, COVID being the only recent one, but I do think that for the foreseeable future, we have to acknowledge that, the trustworthiness and the reliability and the predictability in the U.S. trade relationship will be damaged. And so it is really important, I think, that businesses start looking at other options. So it's just smart business right now. But I am optimistic we'll get to a better place and that this will make us stronger. So thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Christina, as well. And we'll look forward to continuing to work with you. We're also going to stand up a bit of a resource page on our website as well. It'll be sort of an MBOT tariff toolbox or toolkit, just with links to all of the resources that you may be looking for. So we're pleased to do that. And to the earlier point, too, about relationships, you know, at the state level, at the community level, with other chambers, I think it's important that we don't consider those, to your point, Danny, so we don't consider those either to be the solution unto itself, but just a necessary part of maintaining these relationships. And I think we need to take the message that we need to maintain those relationships long after this current stumbling block, if you will, has happened, and long after it's been resolved. That's the only way that we're truly going to win hearts and minds in the long term. So, great. So thank you, everyone, for participating today, most notably our speakers, and we look forward to being in touch soon.